You don't have anything to project?
I do.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I'm not even sure which one it is, but I'll tell you which one it is. My title. It's number one, I think. Yeah.
So this has been confirmed as the global directorship.
No, I used to write my title like that under Eddie because at the time I was the global director.
Yeah.
You know, in that I covered the globe on urban and DRM.
Okay,
no,
okay.
that's you see it's in the social urban rural and design.
Yeah.
So at the time, Eddie referred to me as the global director for urban and disaster. Referred to Maninder as the global director for social, and he is the senior director.
The global.
I realize it's confusing, but
So there was no announcement yesterday?
I think it will happen today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So.
Okay. But you asked her?
Yeah. Connection was more good, so she's coming here.
Okay.
So then it seems to cut what has happened.
Okay. Yes, we should get started.
Just, Thomas, save me one next to you because so I can see the presentation. So I can see the presentation after that. To start when you want. Yeah, when you want. Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we have a quorum now, so we can get started. I'm Joe Lightman from the World Bank's Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. And today we have a very relevant panel on inclusive post-conflict urban reconstruction. A lot of what we talk about during this week is really focused on natural disasters, but many of the approaches that we've developed are applicable not only to post-disaster situations, but also post-conflict situations. And we'll have a chance to look at a couple of frameworks that allow us to understand the reconstruction process following conflict, and the differences also, I think, from the world of natural disaster risk management. And we'll look into several case studies as well, primarily from the Middle East, North Africa region. So we have with us today 4 presenters, and we will also have 2 discussants to reflect on the presentations. The presentations will be short but sweet, and one of our presenters is actually going to be beamed in from Brussels, I think. Yeah. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, and that is Dr. Sameh Wahba, who is an Egyptian national and is the World Bank's Global Director for Urban and Territorial Development, Disaster Risk Management, and Resilience at our Global Practice on Social, Rural, Urban, and Resilient Development. He's based in Washington, D.C., and he oversees the formulation of the bank's strategy, design, and delivery of lending, technical assistance, policy advisory activities, and partnerships across all of the regions where the World Bank works. So, Sameh is going to talk about a framework and its application in the case of Lebanon.
I guess this one is working okay. Good morning. So pleasure to be here and to see many familiar faces from the presentation on yesterday. I don't want to be repeating quite a few of what I've mentioned yesterday. Yesterday we discussed a bit on the framework, which UNESCO and the World Bank have jointly developed on trying to place culture as the foundation for post-conflict, post-disaster reconstruction and recovery of cities. So, and the argument that we've made yesterday is that, at times, the differing pressure between what needs to be established urgently versus what's needed in the medium and long term in terms of reconstruction, especially in context of historical urban landscapes, might come at odds. And also you might have certain discrepancies between what might be deemed as people-based or people-centered strategies versus place-based strategies. And investing in a given place obviously has the advantages of regenerating such urban places, valorizing sunk investments that have happened, but at the same time, if these places, for instance, in a context of slums or other neighborhoods or areas that have a certain homogenization of, if you will, the income groups, such interventions might be perceived as not perhaps offering, if you will, opportunities for the population to be able to move to other places, helping, if you will, in mobility, whereas investing in such approaches like vouchers or what have you, approaches that are centered on the demand that can help people, for instance, access housing or access services in other places, have the advantage of responding to people's choices and including locational choices, but also could be seen as turning their back, if you will, on existing neighborhoods and places. So what we were trying to argue is the importance of constantly cementing that sense of identity, sense of place in people-centered type approaches and ensuring that place-based approaches also center around the communities, their involvement from the onset in terms of defining priorities, defining the scope of interventions, and involving the communities in the design and implementation, and even in the monitoring, and of course post-completion, ownership, appropriation of the assets, their operation and maintenance. So to the extent that we can ensure those 2 dimensions, that we're really weaving place-based strategies and people-based strategies towards a common outcome and ensuring that culture underpins this course. So I think this is more or less, if you will, the framework that we've developed, UNESCO and the World Bank. There's nothing particularly earth-shattering or there's no rocket science in there. And this is all sustainable development. It makes sense. But when we approach this, we discovered, our 2 organizations, the World Bank and UNESCO, that sometimes we were at odds. Some folks in UNESCO, always thought that the World Bank is just about building infrastructure and turning its back on historic cities, and it's, that constant, just bulldozer going in to implement infrastructure. And maybe, some folks in the World Bank thought that UNESCO was just, focused on maintaining, if you will, the historic urban landscapes, whereas their own recommendation about the historic urban landscapes and the way you adapt to evolving context is, of course, a flexible one. So I think this was more even a position paper to get our two teams to think, that we have, in many ways a common ownership of the agenda of post-conflict, post-disaster reconstruction and recovery. This is one of our operations that I wanted to share with you in Lebanon. Sorry. This is one of our operations in Lebanon called the Cultural Heritage and Urban Development Project, which we've implemented in Lebanon in the aftermath, of course, of the civil war. It was a context of fragility and violence. There's been quite widespread sectarian violence in Lebanon during that civil war period, 75 to 90. There has been some widespread destruction of the infrastructure, and of course, poverty and unemployment were widespread. At the same time, institutional capacity, especially at subnational level for service delivery, has been limited, and there has been external shocks as well in terms of conflict with outside of the boundaries that were all creating the context in which our operation in Lebanon intervened. So since 2003, this project has been put together by a group of entities, the bank, working together with the government of Lebanon, the government of Italy, and the Agence Française de Développement, who have joined forces. And their objective was to regenerate 5 historic cities in Lebanon. These are Tripoli, Byblos, Baalbek, Saida, and Tyre, which are, of course, dotted with lots of historical buildings and historical core, and have tremendous potential, be it in tourism, be it in urban regeneration, and that could create opportunities for employment. But this heritage has been neglected, if you will, and overall the infrastructure was suffering from serious deficiencies. So I'm going to showcase just a couple of interventions that we've done in Tripoli and Tyre, and walk you through a little bit what, the process that went through thinking about, identifying these investments and putting in place the related intervention. This particular site, which is Khan al-Askar, basically it's a caravanserai, a souk, if you will, and it used to be the one for the silk trade, and it was built in the late 13th or 14th century. This is how it used to look, and so the focus of the project over here has been on the rehabilitation of this khan. It has a historical importance because it was its location in between the historic core of Tyre and the rest of the city. It served very much as a hinge from a spatial perspective. And also there has been the involvement of a variety of NGOs and community-based organizations in the identification of this asset, the programming of what activities would go into it, and thinking about embedding community development projects as part of it. So this included projects, 2 components targeting children and youth, and another one targeting women. It was for children and youth. It's about, providing teaching support, recreational opportunities for young people. And then for women, there was a lot of emphasis on providing artisanal skills development related to activities and helping them develop their own products for marketing and sales. So, at the end of the day here, this was not the revitalization of an asset, and this is what it looks like after the revitalization, and this is the type of programming that is meant to transform this asset into a center, a cultural center, but also a center that can help in terms of livelihoods and support for the wider community. Again, when you're talking about in a context of a city in a post-conflict reconstruction and recovery, you'll hear a lot of competing demands. You'll hear demands about, helping revitalize private assets, specifically housing, because much of the housing of the communities tends to be affected. But also you'll find in other places, like when we've encountered in Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the emphasis has been, on the priority established on revitalizing the historic bridge, because it used to be the bridge that connected the 2 warring communities, and it was what created opportunities for mobility, access to jobs, etc. So you'll find that there's a lot of competing demands. So the idea of being able to identify potential assets that could serve for, as community centers, that could serve as places that could respond to various needs and priorities of different community groups, youth, inclusion, in places, that are lacking in public space, that are lacking opportunities, and also helping develop the livelihoods for women because of the presence of a large number of female-headed households was deemed to be an important approach. In Tripoli, I mean, again, this is, the Tripoli marketplace, again, another example. I mean, after the hostilities, I mean, there's been a lot of informal trading, a lack of facilities that have, if you will, minimum comfort or hygiene, or that could create spaces for expanding the trading opportunities. I mean, there used to be lots of disputes between the vendors, occupation of public space, etc. And these types of issues, as you're trying, again, to bring about the reconstruction, the process that happened was to try to incorporate these activities within a much more modernized public space, but one that's responding to the community's needs and priorities in terms of its design, in terms of the spaces that it carries, so that you can create economic activities, but also you create community activities. And in particular, over there, I mean, Tripoli also used to suffer issues, and this market ended up being one of the places that brought together both Lebanese and Syrian traders, whom hitherto, if you will, there were quite a bit of conflict because of the way it was designed and the way it was programmed in terms of its public spaces. In Tyre, I mean, again, the Fisherman Harbor was another example. I mean, this is, the harbor and the fishing market at the center of it. And again, an important asset because it has been obviously a major driver of economic activities in the community. But it's also a public space that brings the community together and brings the community from a variety, if you will, of income segments, and the revitalization of it produced something that looks like this. And again, it had a particularly important symbolism, and it was one of the rare spaces in the city that was inhabited with perfect symbiosis between the Christian and the Muslim communities, whom otherwise in the city, had segregated quarters, etc. So this, I mean, being the place of economic opportunity, I mean, they've mingled. So investing in the upgrading of that space and creating attractive public spaces and amenities for the fishermen, but also for the consumers, was an important investment. So I think this was a thread that ran throughout the project, which is the combination of looking at public facilities and amenities, public spaces, valorizing important cultural heritage elements, and at the same time thinking about local economic development and private business opportunities that could create, improved livelihoods for the community, and could, in certain cases like this particular fishing port, serve as reconciliation spaces between communities that have faced challenges before. Now, these are, if you will, the three main messages from our framework, which reflected themselves into the configuration of this project. One, which is, reconstruction and recovery is not just a mere act of, built bricks and mortar that are being put into place. I mean, there's a culture needs to be as a foundation for this reconstruction and recovery process. It ensures that, in a post-conflict setting in particular, that the reconstruction and recovery ensures that a sense of identity is in place, a sense of appropriation of the communities of these assets. And then throughout these investments, the critical, and if you will, the million-dollar question will always be, how do you balance what, that immediate and urgent need to intervene with, and inject recovery very quickly, with the need to ensure that the reconstruction and recovery process does not really compromise, if you will, the historic character of the place, the sense of identity of the place. So you want to do things fast, but at the same time not do them too fast, so as you lose about the sense of identity and the sense of what makes this a cohesive and distinctive community with character. So I leave you with these messages, and happy to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sameh. We'll take questions at the latter part of the session, so if you could just hold your thoughts. I just wanted to say I was in Lebanon last month, and I had a chance to see another city that was part of the same project, Byblos, where there was major renovation of what is the oldest inhabited, continuously inhabited city in the world. It's been inhabited for 6,000 years. And there the value added was not only the social cohesion through the investments that were made, but also a massive contribution to tourism and local economic development. So it's a very interesting dimension of the theme we're talking about today. All right, now I'd like to invite Dr. Irfan Ali to speak. He's the director of UN Habitat's Regional Office for Arab States based in Cairo, and he was previously the head of Habitat's Iraq program for 5 years, from 2013 to 2018. Throughout his career, he's had multiple positions dealing with urban and housing issues, and Dr. Ali has a doctorate from the Université de Paris and Marne-la-Vallée in France. So, Dr. Ali, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks for, it's a pleasure to be with you today. I will highlight on a new policy framework that was agreed between UN Habitat, the World Bank, and the EU in 2018 in the World Urban Forum in Kuala Lumpur to develop a kind of recovery framework, an urban recovery framework in the context of violent conflicts. This presentation, in today's presentation, I will highlight on the concept, on the tools that have been piloted during the last 2 or 3 years in different contexts in the Arab or the MENA region, and the way forward. As we all know that modern conflicts are protracted, national but involving multinational actors mobilized around identity, historic or emerging grievances, socially divisive and prone to radicalization. There are common aspects of urban conflicts represented by exclusion from political power, unequal access to land and natural resources, uneven access to basic services, and usually security and justice institutions are perceived to be unfair or biased in these contexts. However, the reactionary nature of conflicts and insurgency are also revolving around who conquers or who control the cities. Many cities also become divided. The urban warfare is becoming increasingly violent and destructive, causing massive disruption in the complex urban system that are difficult to be restored. There are features. There are features to the urban aspects of conflicts that make them quite predictable and that hold the keys for sustainable urban recovery. Usually the urban conflicts are triggered by uncontrolled or unmanaged demographic movements, unmanaged urban growth that would lead to sprawl of substandard informal areas or slums that would lead also to increasing poverty and fragility, the emergence of poverty pockets, fragility, insecurity. That will lead also to asserted identities and the rise of anti-migration rhetoric that would also lead to poor that would be exacerbated by the poor urban policies and poor urban planning that would lead definitely to undermining the local governance in this context. Lessons learned from the engagement in the Arab or the MENA region helped us during the last 2 years to join the efforts to formulate the urban recovery framework. But why we need the urban recovery framework? Usually, first, First, the data that usually we collect in the context of urban conflicts cannot or do not capture the complex urban centers. Second, the humanitarian. We all know that the humanitarian operations and the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, lack the urban lens in the context of response. Third, the silo sectoral approaches fails usually in the face of enormous needs, while the area-based approaches and sequencing are key to manage the recovery resources. Fourth, municipalities usually do not have a seat on the humanitarian table, and they are not prepared or capacitated, and they need to have access to international and national systems. Fifth, tools and methodologies are not readily available for government and international actors in the phase to face or to encounter huge urban challenges. Therefore, accumulated experiences need to be mainstreamed. Six, municipalities, multiplicity of funding instruments lack the spatial coherence that is needed for urban recovery. So new financing and implementation strategies are needed. So all these aspects are captured in the URF, or the Urban Recovery Framework, as an enabling institutional and policy framework and related programming to support the resilient urban recovery and the renewal of the social contract. We tried to reflect the definition of the Urban Recovery Framework in this structure. I will not go through the structure to respect the timing, but I will go directly to highlight on the main components of the Urban Recovery Framework. The first main component that I would like to highlight in the URF, or the Urban Recovery Framework, is related to the common urban information baseline. As usually the pre-conflict sectoral or according to this the main component, the pre-conflict sectoral and the spatial studies should be analyzed within the concept of the URF. The risk and conflict analysis is essential to local and national response and to devising the safeguards and the implementation arrangements. DNA, or the damage needs assessment, whether comprehensive or dynamic, using mixed methods and multi-partnerships. Data usually, or data should be collected during the active conflict with a view of feeding the recovery and peace building assessment, the new standard that agreed between the EU, the World Bank, and the United Nations in this context that replaced the PCNA, the post-conflict needs assessment, and where possible, this data should be aligned with the SDGs and the new urban agenda, and for sure data should be age and gender disaggregated. The example of the ongoing collaboration between the World Bank, UN Habitat, and the EU in Syria on the urban profiling is an explicit example of this component of the URF. As we see as we will go quickly through the examples or the case studies from the MENA or the Arab region, this is the recovery, reconstruction, and resilience data platform that was developed between UN Habitat and the Ministry of Planning in Iraq as a main coordination, monitoring, and decision-making tool for the recovery and reconstruction of the country. Also, we see different examples from the profiling in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, Palestine, in Lebanon. We see the example of the Mosul data, the Mosul profile that was leveraged as a major advocacy tool to promote different aspects of sustainable urban recovery, including return, reintegration, social protection and reconciliation, cultural and environmental protection, open space and youth integration. The profile became as a vehicle for governance upgrade and local dialogue. We see also other, these are examples from Libya, from Aleppo. The second main component of the urban recovery framework is related to the development of a vision and strategic objectives in the context of urban conflicts. As urban recovery vision involving multi-stakeholder dialogue can be useful during the development of the peace process. This also would help to shape the strategic objectives of urban recovery along a common theme that can be strengthening social cohesion, reconciliation, governance, etc. The initial planning framework of Mosul, this one represent the vision or the strategic objective that was developed for the recovery and reconstruction to enable urban area-based coordination, create advocacy tool to capture donors' momentum, also identify grievances, emerging or historic grievances, sources of social tension, focus on the old city to protect its identity. Also, the collaboration under this vision or under this framework between Habitat and UNESCO proved to be crucial for merging advocacy, sequencing, and heritage protection of the old city. Fourth, these are all examples or slides from the framework. The third main component related to programming, as we all know that resources will be limited and the operational context will constantly be evolving, so we need a more strategic and iterative approach for planning in the different stages. So at the national, sorry, I think I should go back. At the national level, we should focus on strategic prioritization of the cities. We need to ensure impact at the larger rural areas and geographic diversity. At the city level, we need to focus on overcoming divisiveness, social tension, prioritize catalytic investment, and select vulnerable neighborhood. This will also enable us to support vulnerable households, but without losing the area-based objectives. And the example of this is the equity housing funding that was implemented in Iraq, and through this intervention also some attention was focused on the need to address issues related to housing, land, and property rights, and we can go through into details related to this point in the during the discussion. I will jump directly to the fourth component related to the institutional framework that are needed in the context of urban conflict, because most pre-crisis institutional structures are not geared to enable municipalities, private sector, civil society to contribute to urban recovery. So, 1 minute. Okay, I will go quickly. So work on the institutional framework must begin as early as possible, even during the conflict, and as influencing institutional structures would require considerable advocacy efforts. And the example of this kind of work is the HLP, the Housing, Land, Property institutional structure that was developed, or that currently recently developed in Syria through collaboration or through support from the European Union. The last component main component of the URF is related to the funding or the financing strategies, as government and donor funding is never sufficient. Managing the popular expectations and the clear outreach strategies are fundamental. So we need to leverage various contributions those various contributions should be included in and diversified, that to include households through skilled labor, savings, loans, civil society organizations and charity, private sector through public-private partnership, blended funding, real estate developers, corporate social reconciliation schemes, governments, also international assistance. The multi-year budgeting can contribute also to the predictability of response and is required to address the trunk infrastructure investment. Finally, what are the next or the way forward? We hope that we will continue working together to reflect the global trends and the ongoing country experiences within a handbook that will be developed by between the World Bank, the EU, and UN Habitat, to be launched in the forthcoming World Urban Forum in Abu Dhabi in February 2020, through a consultative process. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ali. And I'm struck that at the same time we're about to come out with a local disaster recovery framework guide that has very much the same structure and is intended for municipalities and civil society organizations. So it will be good to coordinate on the launching of the handbook for the URF and the DRF guide. Okay, I'd like to move now to our speaker who will be remotely connected, and that is Martina Halkia. She is leading the Peace and Stability in Disaster Risk Management Unit of the Space Security and Mitigation Directorate in the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. She's an engineer who's focused on urban studies, humanities, and ICT, and she's particularly interested in the spatial aspects of conflict vectors and conflict smoothing, the role of urban conflict and actor-centered events that contribute to the cascading effect of conflict in trigger models, as well as post-conflict urban profiling and reconstruction. And Martina will focus specifically on the role of satellite remote sensing to fill in that first aspect of the URF, which is the data and monitoring. Over to you, Martina.
Here's a beautiful day. We're actually in the Lake Maggiore. The Joint Research Center is based in Italy. It's actually over 5 locations in Europe, but the main location is in Ispra in Italy, 2,500 researchers. Now, I am on this device, so I can't hear you. I was hearing you on the other device. So I will go straight for 10 minutes, and then I will put on my other headphones to be able to listen to your comments. Right. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be with you today because of the unexpected problem I had with my mobility. I have impaired mobility, but thanks to my colleague, Miss Chiara Mellucci, and the ICT team on your side, I'm able to join in this very, very interesting session, I have to say. I'm impressed by the presentations that preceded me, and I think it flows quite well into what I have to talk about today, which is the damage assessment work that we did in Syria in support of the urban profiling work, which will ultimately feed into the urban recovery and reconstruction framework. So I will switch on my presentation right now. Turn off the video so that you can I can fully dedicate the bandwidth to the presentation. So I would like to start with what the JRC does, you may not know that the JRC is one of the Directorate Generals, but it's the one who does not do policy, does not provide policy, but provides scientific and technical support to policy. We are involved, we are in the Space Security and Migration Directorate, the Peace and Stability team. In the Space Security and Migration Directorate, and we are involved with knowledge production. The JRC mission is to provide independent evidence throughout the whole policy cycle. And the team that I lead on peace and stability in the disaster risk management unit works on the entire conflict management cycle, from early warning and conflict prevention, providing conflict risk models, situation awareness and monitoring, providing geospatial support for ongoing crises and hotspots around the world, and post-conflict recovery, supporting the post-conflict analysis in Syria through damage assessment and agricultural monitoring for the through remote sensing. So we are mostly engineers, but also political scientists in the group. So the post-conflict urban profiling, the Syria war, we contribute to the urban profiling, considering that the analysis of urban areas is an adaptive exercise of how cities are functioning or not functioning. And we focus on the physical infrastructure of the cities. So using very high resolution satellite imagery, we have been able to map damage building by building in 60 cities in Syria. We have compiled a land use, land cover database in 40 Syrian cities using open source information and satellite imagery. And we have performed agricultural activity assessment in the most hard-hit Syrian governorates before, during, and after the conflict. This information, which you see here in the two maps that we provide, the JRC produced, feeds into the neighborhood profiles for the cities prepared and produced by the Urban-S network, the Urban Syria network, which is financed by the EU to perform work for the urban recovery framework. So the JRC contribution to the Syria DNA has started in 2013, where we performed preliminary damage assessment in 13 urban areas and continued. We're now in phase 3, which we have started in phase 3 in 2019. And we have produced in the course of our activity supporting damage assessment in Syria, the 3 internal reports which you see, which we share with our partners, of course, on the left. And we developed a methodology to assess the damage, which has been shared with our partners, as mentioned also in the presentation before, with UN Habitat and the World Bank. We collaborate in the urban recovery framework. So the content of this presentation today, I will show you what our work entails in terms of damage assessment in many Syrian cities, the land use, land cover classification, how we perform it, the land use changes during and after the conflict, and agricultural assessment. We will not touch upon agricultural assessment specifically, but it is to know that we also, I mean, I listed here just for you to be aware of the fact that we also look at the urban-rural linkages and how agricultural activities can feed or not in the conflict in urban areas. So damage assessment using VHR data. This is just for you to see how what is our work. It's like an example of a satellite image pre and post conflict. What we do is we classify building by building with visual interpretation the scale of destruction at the building. You see here in dots colored from yellow to orange to red to deep red, the various classes which represent light damage, moderate damage, severely damaged and destroyed, going from the light color to the darker color in increasing degrees of gravity. these can easily be regrouped in two classes, the 1 and 2 as light moderate damage, and the 3 and 4 as severely damaged and destroyed. We know the World Bank uses two classes. Of course, there are differences in the way you approach damage assessment from remotely from satellites, and differences in remote sensing evaluation from ground control actors. Two examples of how the damage map in two cities in Syria can give us information about the conflict dynamics on the ground. On the left, Raqqa, where you see the damage is extensive all over the city. Instead, in Deir ez-Zor on your right, there is a clear front line that divides the two parts of the city, the one controlled by the Syrian regime, and the one on the right by the rebels, the one hard hit by the damage. Going up one scale higher at district level, we see the city as it, and this actually is a map that's coming from the urban city profile that I showed the cover before, that's been produced by the Urban S network. The damage can be coded and classified by neighborhood. Then at country level, here you see the extent of our activity in the different phases in the course of our work for the support of the urban profiling in Syria. And the actual rectangles that you see are the urban footprints of the satellite, not the urban footprints, the footprints of the satellite images that we have, and the cities we've covered by chronological order. Land use, land cover classification, how do we perform this? This is especially useful when there are no records pre-conflict, or when the records have been destroyed. We visually again interpret, using also open source media, the open news sources and media, and also social media. We classify the classes here, the functional areas of the city. We also have finer grain resolution for the residential class. Here you see the formal settlement. Formal settlement, we don't only classify by the geometric characteristics and the degree of formality or informality, but also in terms of building density. Since 2012, in the context of our work for geospatial situational awareness, we have been mapping weekly the changes of control on the ground, and so we can superimpose the damage with the change of control on the ground, and additionally we can superimpose the change of control on the ground with the damage and the land use, land cover. All of this information is, I believe, critical for reconstruction, and especially if we want to analyze the conflict dynamics. A lot of discussion can be drawn from these images and maps and analysis we've performed in Syria. So just to round up and conclude with my presentation, since the concept of inclusion is key to this event, which is organized this week, I thought I would highlight how our work can support the planning and post-conflict and recovery phase with design practices and policies that support inclusion. I've quoted here the definition of inclusion in the concept paper of the event. So here's an example. In Dara, the difference is quite striking between formal and informal settlements. This is a refugee camp for Palestinians, and this is the damage in the city. As you see, it is concentrated in this informal settlement. Essentially, what we can deduce from that is that this will have to be totally reconstructed, this area, probably razed to the ground and reconstructed from scratch. And it's an opportunity to design inclusion, because if we look at the land use and the functional and the services in the area, there is obvious information we can take into account to plan for an inclusive urban fabric. And this is my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And most of all, I want to thank my team, who has been very supportive in working with me to provide this presentation in this situation of compromised presence. I'm actually joining from home. I'm going to change now my headphones and leave the ground to the moderator, leave the floor to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martina. We're sorry you couldn't join us in person. I'm struck by how powerful satellite remote sensing is for being able to access information in areas where you can't actually be on the ground. And we know that this type of analysis is able to be complemented by social media analytics and by third-party verification of data in conflict situations. So it's part of a very rich body of information that can be used to help plan for post-conflict reconstruction. We'll move now to our final speaker, and that is Tahir Akbar, who is a senior disaster risk management and resilience specialist at the World Bank's Middle East and North Africa region. He works on fragility, conflict, and disaster risk management issues, supporting countries to prepare for and manage crisis situations, and he's the team leader of an urban recovery operation of the Yemen Integrated Urban Services Emergency Project, and he'll be focusing on the experience in Yemen.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And I'll be presenting the World Bank experience of working in Yemen. So those of you who may not know, the World Bank is heavily engaged in Yemen, and we have a portfolio currently worth $1.3 billion that we are delivering for the people of Yemen in coordination with UN agencies. I'll be presenting the experience of the Integrated Urban Services project, highlighting some of the challenges that we faced vis-a-vis the inclusion and otherwise. So before starting the presentation, this is one of my favorite pictures. So this is from the city of Aden. So this is the dialysis center. They had a huge problem. So no electricity. There were 2 parking lots on the side. Cars did not have a shade. So win-win situation. So through this project, so we have put the solar panels on the parking lots. Cars get the shade, hospital get the electricity, and everyone is happy. So this is an excellent example of how we can utilize the space within the urban areas for the benefit of the services. Yeah, it's gone. Yeah. So this integrated urban services operation, Yemen is in the middle of the conflict. So it's an in-conflict operation. And the bank was contemplating whether we can develop a model where we can lay the stones for recovery while the conflict is ongoing. Why? Because the conflict was prolonged. So we cannot wait for a long time. It's already about 5 years into the conflict. Whether we can do something now that can help large-scale recovery and reconstruction down the road. So the objective of the operation was to restore access to critical services in selected urban centers. We deliberately focused on the urban centers in this operation because we want to focus more on the integrated services, the services which cannot be provided through CDD approaches, the services where we need the institutions to work, and they cannot be provided purely through citizen or community-based mechanisms. And the operation is focusing on 5 key areas: water and sanitation, urban roads transport, off-grid electricity. So we are focusing heavily on solar. You saw the example of the dialysis center in Aden. We are focusing on tertiary municipal services and housing, which is a contingent sectors. We are not working on it now. So this picture is basically of one of the city entrances. So we are focusing on rehabilitating the city entrances. What it helps, is to improve the flow of goods that are entering into the city. So we are doing it for all the urban centers that we are currently engaged in. I would like to focus on the area-based approach. So what do we mean by that? We have been talking about it in earlier presentations as well. So we want to have our interventions such that all activities complement each other. So we lay out, so this is again a picture from Eden, and the red lines are the roads that we are rehabilitating. The yellow lines are the street lights. These are solar-based street lights. These blue icons are basically 2 hospitals where we are providing solar solutions, and the green ones are the water. So if you see that if we were only doing roads, or if we were only doing water, or if we were only doing off-grid electricity, we would not have solved the problem of providing adequate services to the inhabitants of this area. So by planning in this manner, using an area-based approach, we are able to have interventions that complement each other. Hospital get the electricity, it get lighting around its area, we get water fixed, and roads are repaired so that access to that hospital is improved. Now, coming to the topic of inclusion. So in the context of conflict, it's very important. And the way we approached inclusion in this project was from 2 perspectives. So first is inclusion of the state institutions. So we need to have the local institutions involved early on so that they can take the reins of recovery and reconstruction when situation becomes normal. We did not want international partners to come in and do something and then go away, because that leaves a vacuum. So that's why we are working with UNOPS on the ground, but we have 3 local partners, which are Yemeni institutions. We are working very closely with them. So this really helps to sustain the capacity of these institutions so that they can take this work forward in a more sustainable manner. Just relying, for example, on UNOPS would not have been a sustainable approach. And the second element of inclusion is the citizen. I'll come to that a bit later. Now, before, I just wanted to show us some other results. So this is a picture from Sana'a. So this is one of the large hospitals in Sana'a. So you can see all the rooftops. Rooftop has been utilized for the solar panels. So it's quite a big operation, and it's in the middle of the conflict. I myself was surprised that we can do that in the middle of the conflict. But it really helped to provide sustainable electricity solution to this hospital. At the other end of the spectrum, this is a very low cost and neighborhood level intervention. So this was a playground that was turned into a dump site. The project helped to basically restore the playground. It's one of the most favorite interventions from the community sites. And then, yes, the fixing of the road and network and other things. So the key results, we have roughly 2.3 million people benefiting from the services under the project. We have 100+ contractors engaged. And this is very, very important figure from the context of in-conflict and post-conflict operations. We need to have contracting capacity on its feet in a fragile situation so that they can deliver when we are engaging in large-scale recovery and reconstruction. So this project is really helping to get the contractors engaged, have works for them, and to keep the capacity in the private sector intact. And then, of course, we are creating some temporary employment. Now, I would like to focus on the few features that really helped us to deliver these results, and we are continuing to deliver. Almost, we are in the midway of this project intervention. So, what is the what is the biggest constant in the conflict situation is uncertainty. So, we are faced with uncertainty all the time. We don't know what would happen the next day. So, the project design has to be very flexible so that we can manage the unknowns. So that for us was the biggest challenge in this operation. So what we deliberately did was we kept the approach of the project very flexible. We did not do any allocations to the cities. We did not do any allocations to the sectors, so that we can, take resources from one area to other as the situation changes. For example, in Hodeidah, in last 1 year, last 6 months, the conflict has escalated. So we were able to just cancel all the operations in Hodeidah and shift them to the other cities. And pragmatic management. So we are involving local institutions and local partners, but we are cognizant of the fact that not all of them are at the same level. So we did an upfront assessment, keeping in view the capacity of those institutions and providing them responsibilities as per their capacity, and providing them incentive that if you do well, you get more responsibility. So in a sense, we have this competition between the local partners. So they see that, oh, the other partner is doing well and they are, getting more resources through the project. So maybe we need to improve. So that sense of competition really helped to drive the capacity of the local partners. Now the inclusion mechanism, vis-a-vis the citizen engagement. And believe me, it has been very challenging. Our experience is easy to say that we want to do citizen engagement, we want to consult with citizens, but to implement it on the ground in a meaningful manner is very difficult task. Just to give you an example, in rebel-controlled areas, the Houthi rebels were saying, oh yeah, you can do citizen engagement, but these are the NGOs that you can engage. Do you think that those NGOs are going to be objective? No. So we said that, no, we cannot do citizen engagement in such a fashion where the government is dictating that you can only work through these specific partners. So these kind of access issues, you cannot do any surveys in a conflict situation. So anyone seeing you with some type of tablet or doing some surveys, we had some people who were actually, taken by the authorities. So doing citizen engagement is very challenging, and we have to come up with very innovative approaches. So in order to keep the project running, so in the first year, frankly, we did not do the citizen engagement. So we had a more of a top-down approach, because we knew, for example, these are the major areas which needs, these are the major hospitals that need electricity solutions, so on and so forth. But in second and third year, we started working with citizens and communities to have their input into the projects that we are selecting, whether you want this neighborhood park to be restored or you want this road to be restored. So let the communities tell us. It's not the engagement process. I would be very open. It's not ideal because of the challenges, but we are trying our best to have citizen voices incorporated into the project design. We kept the project design forward-looking, so it's a scalable operation, so we can expand to other cities, we can expand to other sectors using the same platform. And the very important element is private sector-led service delivery. So we want to engage private sector in the restoration of services. And in some cases, for example, we are also engaging private sector for rental power. Take an example of, let's say certain water pumps. It would take a year to implement a solar solution or other sustainable solution. But can we wait for 1 year? No, we cannot. Citizens need water. So we engage private sector. So they are providing electricity through rental power solutions for that gap to be filled in. Similarly, for solid waste and accumulated waste collection, we are engaging private sector, which is one of the key features of this operation. The other challenge that we faced was the monitoring. So in an in-conflict situation, monitoring is very difficult. So we used remote sensing tools. So an app has been developed. So the city engineers, they can take pictures from the ground, and they can be uploaded into the GIS platform, which is public, so everyone can see it. And this is also another point where we bring in citizen input. So if you are a citizen of Hodeidah, you can go to the platform and you can see what the project is doing, and you can complain if the interventions are being in certain area or certain benefiting certain specific population, so you can raise your voice. So we bring the tools to the citizens to be engaged. So that has been one of the key strategy for the project to get the citizens' opinions on board. And we believe that this is a replicable model that can be implemented in other solutions, in other countries, although we would need certain ground parameters that need to be there in order for such an intervention to be implemented in other situations. So with that, I'll conclude this presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Tahir. It's a very challenging situation for the World Bank to be able to work in a place where we can't physically be there. And so we're very much dependent on and grateful for the partnerships that we have, I think, for that particular operation. UNOPS and the Red Cross.
No, UNOPS.
Just UNOPS, okay. So I'd like to now invite two discussants who we're lucky to have with us to give us some very brief remarks and reflections on what you've heard so far. Let me start with Chiara Melucci, who is a resilience expert with the European Union, and then we'll pass to Maitreyi Das, who is our global lead at the World Bank for Social Inclusion. Chiara.
Thank you, Joe. I hope you can hear me well. I think I have the even more challenging task to open the discussion. My expertise is mostly in disaster risk reduction, so it's been quite a learning session for me as well. My remarks are more comments and noting how many parallels we can draw from the recovery in conflict setting and the recovery in post-disaster settings. Unfortunately, the two communities are often separate, and we are trying very often as well to bring them together to learn from each other, because in many of the presentations I could recognize a lot of the elements that are extremely important also in post-disaster recovery. And perhaps I'll take also this opportunity to flag a session later this afternoon where we will actually discuss recovery in conflict settings, really trying to bring experts from the disaster community and conflict communities together. I just wanted to note a couple of things. One related to culture. We are here discussing about inclusion, and I guess culture and cultural sensitivity is possibly one of the best way also to promote inclusion, and how culture is also extremely important in post-disaster settings. I understand that the CURE framework applies to both, and we have many examples of post-disaster recovery where culture has been a key element for recovery. It's perhaps less obvious than in conflict settings, but disaster is a big shock for the community, and culture can really act also as an element of cohesion, of bringing in positive elements and reduce the stress of the community. It's interesting also to see how in the post-conflict arena, if I can say so, there's been a much more structured codification of collaboration and frameworks. So we are, I'm looking at Joe because we've been working together a lot on the post-disaster recovery, but we are trying to do a bit the same also again in post-disaster recovery. Perhaps I'll conclude just wishing that we can bring forward a bit the discussion on having more integrated sessions and conferences to learn from each other. I think these were very, very useful examples. The project of the bank in Yemen is extremely interesting, and it would be good to see how we can replicate experiences. Thank you.
Thanks, Chiara. And over to you, Maitreyi.
Thank you so much. I just want to start by apologizing to my colleague for being late. I was double booked. I already know about the CURE framework that Samay earlier presented, so my apologies. I don't have a huge amount. I just have 3 points that I wanted to make as far as these presentations are concerned. One, I want to highlight the fact that building back after disaster or after conflict is certainly an opportunity. And that's something that came through in all of the presentations that I heard, was that there is an opportunity. So building back better isn't just about building better infrastructure. Building back better is about building back the soul of the city. And so how do we build back? How do we bring people together around a shared narrative around the soul of a city? And I think that's a challenge that we have, but that's also a huge opportunity in terms of how we build back better. The second thing I wanted to highlight is the issue that has come up in all of these presentations is about intangible assets. And culture being an intangible asset as well, where how do you make sure that culture is used in ways that then build back a city and build back the soul of the city. So that's third point I wanted to make is around communities. Using culture, using local art, local idiom, music, gives an opportunity to bring communities together in the actual act of reconstruction, in the actual process of reconstruction, and how do you create a system which is more bottom-up, if you will, although that term I'm not sure I like very much, but how do you make sure that it leads to increased democratization? How do you make sure that things like folk art that were in the realm of more rural spaces, how do they enter more into urban spaces? How do we get the culture of migrant peoples that feel so sometimes alienated from the city? How do we bring those into the reconstruction process, in the rebuilding process? I think that's a huge opportunity, and it goes beyond citizen engagement, which to my mind is somewhat of a minimalist way of thinking about how you build back a city which is a city for everyone. So the question is, whose city is it? And it enables us to ask the question, to answer that question is, whose city is it? Who do we want to give the city back to? I also want to highlight the fact that culture isn't always a mechanism for cohesion or for inclusion. It's sometimes a mechanism for increased conflict, especially in post-conflict areas. Culture can be highly contested. So whose culture is it? Is it the culture of one group or the other, the dominant group or the subordinate group? And sometimes things like language, music, culture, religion are highly contested parts of the conflict itself, and certainly in the post-conflict period. That said, it also provides an opportunity to build a new culture and to build a synthetic culture that then brings together both the sort of warring parties, if you will, together in the construction of this new city or this new arena that we're trying to give back to the residents of the city. And I also don't want to use the term citizens, because some people may not be citizens. They may be residents. And it's important to acknowledge the fact that there are residents of the city that sometimes feel highly alienated because of exactly their citizenship status. So those are some of the issues that came to my mind as I was listening, and I look forward to the discussion from the audience.
Okay, good. Well, we have about 10 minutes for discussion, and so we'd like to open it up to the floor. Are there questions or answers? Please, just tell us who you are and what your institutional affiliation is, and hopefully that microphone is live. Maybe switch it on. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, it does work. Excellent. I'm Amanda Entrikin with Habitat for Humanity International. I have a question for the woman who joined us remotely, and then a second question that maybe someone else on the panel might be able to address. And I apologize, I came in late, so I don't know what I missed. But first and foremost, can I ask a question to the woman from the European Commission? Yeah, okay. Firstly, the data was fascinating. The images were incredibly useful and informative. And I'm just wondering if it's a resource being made available to Syrian refugees themselves. We know that at least as far as I'm aware, Syrian refugees from Turkey have been granted on some occasions visas, re-entry visas, so they can go home and check out their context and check out the damage to their homes and are able to go back to Turkey if their homes aren't habitable. In Lebanon and Jordan, there is not the same kind of access to their home state. So something like that might be very useful for individuals in assessing if they're able to go back to Syria or not. The second question is, in a way, is complementary to what the second discussant was saying regarding who is the city for. And when seeing images of informal settlements in Dara that have been completely destroyed and the kind of inequality of destruction, there's the understanding that in informal settlements there's maybe a different agreement regarding security of tenure. And before we raise or flatten these places, you know, and this is something that at Habitat for Humanity we think about a lot, you know, how are we going to map ownership or occupation in those spaces? I mean, these people don't have insurance. They would have no way of kind of recuperating those losses from losing their shelter. So how, as a Reconstruction humanitarian development community, are we accounting for that, and how will we go forward in the most inclusive way?
Okay, thanks. Before we ask Martina to come on, are there any other questions for Martina? We can have her then answer a block of questions. Your question is for specifically Martina.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm from Nepal. I'm Japar Singh Vishwakarma, working in National Reconstruction Authority, Center Level Project Implementation Unit, Deputy Project Director. So my question regarding the Yemen Integrated Urban Service Emergency Project. I was very happy to listen that that Yemen Integrated Urban Service Emergency Project. My query is, how do you do? What is your experience in this? What is your experience in that project to mitigate the risk of the contractor? Because there is a chance of many risks for the contractors. And how did you address those risks in mitigation in procurement, especially in procurement for the local contractors or contractors? Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thanks. Well, let's turn it over first to Martina, if our technology permits that to happen. Martina, the question was, what's the degree of availability of the data to the Syrian refugees for their own use?
Right. I'm switching now, sorry. Actually, this is a question, sorry, I have sound coming back and forth. Can someone, okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is a question actually to address to our partners on the ground. It's a very interesting question. I remember in the second donors meeting last year, there were a lot of donor countries who were asking me the same question, and also how to use this data to how can I say, feed into the reconciliation process. Obviously, the data we produce are very rich and very useful in many different ways. We, from our side, not being involved in the policy, where the technical people that provide the technical input, I would not have any specific or precise information for that. I would have to ask the EU delegation in Syria and our partners in the Urbanist Network. Obviously, UN Habitat, they have control, they have actors on the ground, so I'm not sure how the data is used, but I know there has been several discussions and requests in this direction that you mentioned. Now, with regard to, and I don't know if I answered your question, but that is the best I can do with the information I have. As I said, we're the technical and evidence-based support service of the European Commission. Now, the second part about the mapping of inequality, now that is a very interesting point, which I try to highlight, in fact, with regard to the concept of inclusion and how to design for inclusion in this reconstruction recovery framework that we are discussing today. In fact, remote sensing is quite powerful because it gives us, let's say, consistent and objective information, data. So it reveals angles that not necessarily are there when you look at the conflict analysis from the ground level. Of course, conflict analysis at the ground level is very important, and you've seen that in the presentation by, I think, the second speaker. But the data we observe, we have from remote sensing are very powerful in revealing angles of inequalities that maybe are not perceived from the ground.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Martina. I'd like to turn over the question on how to map and plan for the informal settlements to both Same and Irfan, if you would take that on.
Yeah, so I think if I understood the question correctly, regarding property rights in context of informal settlements and conflict, and I think in this case, I mean, there's a lot of, if you will, community involvement in the mediation and the adjudication of disputes related to property rights that you use in other contexts, and you need to draw on these methods. I mean, whether it's a tsunami, if you will, that wipes out Aceh and wipes up all the records and the meets and bounds of the properties, and therefore you're starting on a tabula rasa, or it's a conflict that leaves also a situation of precarity. I mean, you're going to have to, I don't see any other option. I mean, I work a lot on issues of informal and land tenure regularization in informal settlements, and you end up having a lot of, in context of insecure and weak property rights, of disputes that you end up mediating by involving community groups to establish, the boundaries in between them, to bring about issues related to absentee landowners and right holders, and you'll have to rely on some sort of a communal system to bring about this adjudication of property rights in such settings.
Thank you. I would like to reflect on both questions. We start with regard to the documentation of property rights. In the context of informal settlement, in the context of disputed areas, conflict, destroyed areas also, we are using the social tenure domain model, which we've developed and implemented in several countries, and we are implementing this now in the Arab or MENA region, in Iraq, in Libya, in Iraq, with focus on the destroyed areas in Mosul, in Nineveh Plain, also it addresses issues or claims for historic or long-lasted claims of the Yazidi community in Sinjar area since the 70s. We are documenting these claims and developing or issuing a kind of occupancy certificates to recognize the property rights of the vulnerable groups, and we are aiming at developing this also for the refugees in both in Jordan and in Lebanon, and we've started doing some work in that regard. With regard to the first question related to the availability of the data or the profiling work for the refugees, the ambition is to make this kind of data available, as we are doing now in Iraq and Libya. And I can invite you to visit the data portal. I showed the data portal on the screen. I can give you the address, where we've included all the relevant assessments related to the destructions, related to the conflict analysis, related to the guidance with regard to the recovery efforts in on the different stages of recovery. However, on Syria in particular, there are some considerations, some political considerations, yet we are not able to make this data available to the refugees. But we hope that this kind or this product would be available to help in the for the sustainable return of the refugees. And allow me also to acknowledge the collaboration with GRC, not only in Syria, in Libya, and currently on Yemen. And thank you so much.
Good. And we'll close with Tahir. I'm afraid we don't have any more time for questions, but some of the panelists can stay afterwards to answer your questions. For Tahir to respond to the question on the Yemen project.
So the procurement risk is very valid in this context, and we mitigate it in two ways. So first is minimizing the exposure of procurement risk with the local partners. So they were allowed to procure up to a certain threshold. So below that threshold, they were using their own procedures, because we didn't want to get in a situation where they have to get approvals from the national and regional entities for higher procurement thresholds. So where the thresholds were higher, we utilized UNOPS. So UNOPS was using their own procedures, so that helped to mitigate that risk.
All right. Well, thank you all for participating, and let's have a round of applause for our panelists, our discussants, and that includes Martina, who's remotely connected. Thanks, and I invite you all now to lunch.